Have you ever wondered what happens when police officers, those who face danger every day, encounter the inexplicable? In today's video, we're going to explore 7 horror stories involving police officers based on real accounts that will give you goosebumps. Get ready to dive into scary cases that show that not even the law is immune to the supernatural. And before we start, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this. On to the video. 1. The Call of the Forest. It was a cold, moonless night when officers Daniel Harper and Ethan Collins received the call. The car radio crackled with the nervous voice of a woman who said she had heard screams coming from Blackwood Forest on the outskirts of a small town in the state of Vermont, in the United States. Blackwood was a place shrouded in mystery, known for its dark legends and unexplained disappearances. "It's probably just another group of teenagers playing tricks," said Daniel, trying to ease the tension he was feeling. Ethan, however, was uneasy. He had grown up hearing stories about the forest, ancient rituals, hooded figures, and a creature that no one could fully describe. Despite his skepticism, something seemed different that night. As they drove along the deserted road that led into the forest, the silence was almost unbearable. The tall trees formed unsettling shadows under the faint glow of the headlights. "Have you heard of the legends?" asked Ethan, breaking the silence. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Legends are just that. Stories to scare children. Let's not lose our heads over rumors." But when they reached the entrance to the forest, they both felt an inexplicable chill. The wooden gate that marked the start of the trail was ajar, creaking gently in the wind. There was no sign of teenagers or anyone else around. Just the sound of the wind between the trees and an oppressive silence that seemed to engulf everything around. With flashlights in hand and guns in their holsters, they entered the darkness. The screams began again, high-pitched, desperate, but impossible to pinpoint. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees as if the forest itself were alive. "That doesn't make sense," muttered Daniel, looking around with wide eyes. Following the sound, they came to a clearing where the ground was marked with strange symbols drawn in something that looked like dried blood. In the center were bones arranged in a ritualistic pattern that neither of them recognized. The metallic smell in the air was nauseating. "This isn't normal," said Ethan, swallowing as he illuminated the symbols with his shaky flashlight. Before they could investigate further, a pop from the trees caught their attention. The flashlights illuminated a tall, deformed figure moving between the shadows. The creature had eyes glowing like embers and a twisted body covered in something that looked like skin and moss. "Stop! Police!" shouted Daniel, pointing his gun at the figure. The creature advanced with an impossibly human movement, too fast for something that size. Without hesitation, the two fired their guns repeatedly. The bullets hit their target with dry bursts, but had no effect. The creature kept coming towards them, emitting a guttural sound that seemed to mix anger and pain. "Run!" shouted Ethan, pulling Daniel by the arm as they hurried back along the narrow forest path. The creature's heavy footsteps echoed behind them like hammers against the damp ground. On their way back to the vehicle, they stumbled over something partially buried under dry leaves, an old rusty sign with the words, "Private property, entry prohibited." But before they could process what this meant, they heard another sound, no longer the creature's footsteps, but low, indistinct whispers coming from the surrounding trees. Finally, they reached the road where they had parked the car. As they got into the car and sped away, the sound of footsteps ceased abruptly at the edge of the forest. They were both panting and in shock. Back at the police station, they reported what had happened to the chief of police, but their words were met with skepticism. "You must have seen a bear or something," said the chief as he reviewed old reports on Blackwood. It was then that Ethan found something disturbing in the archives. records of other police officers sent to the forest decades ago to investigate similar cases of nocturnal screams. None of them had returned. The searches were ended without conclusive explanations, and the cases filed away as disappearances. Over the next few days, Daniel began to have recurring nightmares about the creature and the symbols in the clearing. Ethan began to hear whispers whenever he was alone, voices that seemed to call him back to the forest. A week after the incident, Daniel disappeared without a trace. His vehicle was found abandoned at the entrance to Blackwood Forest, with the doors open and the radio still on. The last record picked up by the microphone was a low whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." Ethan asked for a transfer away from the city soon after his partner's disappearance, but was never able to completely escape the trauma of that fateful night. Years later, now retired and living in another town, Ethan received an anonymous letter containing just one photograph. The clearing in Blackwood Forest, illuminated by moonlight, and in the center of it was Daniel Harper standing next to the deformed creature. The Blackwood Forest remains untouched to this day, avoided by all the locals, and those who get close swear they hear distant screams on the darkest nights, a dark call that no one dares to answer. 2. The case of the abandoned hospital. The night was cold and damp when the police team received the call. A night watchman, making rounds in a decaying industrial area on the outskirts of Detroit, reported seeing lights and movement in the old St. Mary's Hospital, which had been closed for more than 30 years. The hospital was known for its dark history. In 1987, an unexplained massacre took the lives of dozens of patients and staff. Since then, the building had remained abandoned, shrouded in urban legends and rumors of hauntings. Sergeant William Carter led the team, made up of 3 other officers: Sarah Miller, a skeptical investigator; Lucas Ramirez, a young police officer who had just graduated; and Henry Doyle, a veteran with decades of service. Despite the macabre stories about the hospital, everyone was convinced that it was just a case of trespassers or vandals. When they arrived at the site, the scene was bleak. The imposing building was surrounded by vegetation that had grown out of control over the years. The broken windows and peeling walls seemed to stare at the policemen like empty eyes. "It's more like a horror movie than a real incident," joked Ramirez, trying to ease the tension. Armed with flashlights and guns, they entered the hospital through the main door, which was ajar. The air inside was heavy and smelled of mold and rust. The corridors were long and dark, with graffiti marks on the walls and abandoned medical equipment scattered on the floor. However, what caught the team's attention were the flashing lights at the end of the main corridor, something impossible in a building without electricity for decades. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Sarah as they walked towards the lights. Suddenly, they heard a distant sound, indistinct voices echoing through the empty corridors. "There's someone here," said Carter, gesturing for everyone to pay attention. The voices became clearer as they advanced. They were fragments of conversations, occasional laughter mixed with cries of pain. When they reached the end of the corridor, they found a room with hospital beds lined up. The lights flashed frantically, briefly illuminating human figures who disappeared as soon as the flashlights were pointed at them. This isn't possible," said Ramirez, breaking out in a cold sweat. Before they could react, all the lights went out at once, plunging the hospital into total darkness. That's when it began. A deafening sound of medical alarms going off simultaneously echoed through the corridors. The voices returned, now louder and more distressing. "Let's get out of here," Carter ordered, but as they tried to return the way they came, they noticed something strange. The corridors looked different. The doors were in the wrong places, the graffiti had disappeared, and the floors were as clean as if the hospital was up and running again. "That's not possible," Sarah repeated as she looked around. It was then that they saw people, doctors and nurses rushing down the corridors with stretchers and medical equipment. But there was something wrong. No one seemed to notice the presence of the police. "Are we trapped in some kind of hallucination?" suggested Ramirez in a shaky voice as he watched a nurse walk past him as if she were invisible. Suddenly, deafening screams echoed through the building. The officers ran in the direction of the sound and arrived in a room where patients were being attacked by a man armed with a bloody axe. The scene was horrific. Blood dripped down the walls as the victims screamed for help. "That's the massacre!" exclaimed Doyle when he recognized the scene described in historical accounts of the hospital. Carter tried to intervene, but as he fired his gun at the attacker, he realized that his bullets simply passed through the man, as if he were made of smoke. "We can't change any of this," Sarah said with wide eyes as she pulled Carter out of the room. The team continued to wander the hospital's endless corridors in search of a way out. But every time they tried to return to the main entrance, they ended up back in the same room where the massacre was taking place, as if they were stuck in a time loop. "We're reliving these people's last moments," Doyle concluded as he watched the scene repeat itself for the third time, "and if we can't get out before the end, maybe we'll be stuck here forever." Despair began to take hold of the group as spectral figures began to appear around them. Patients covered in blood pointing at the policemen as if blaming them for their deaths. The voices now whispered their names repeatedly: Carter, Miller, Ramirez, Doyle. Finally, Sarah had a desperate idea. "Maybe we need to go to the end of the massacre to get out of here." Reluctantly, they all agreed and returned to the main room where everything was happening. This time, they stayed until the last moment, until the killer disappeared along with his victims in a final deafening scream. The hospital was plunged back into absolute silence. When they opened their eyes, they were standing outside the abandoned building in the dim light of dawn. Everyone was alive, but scarred by the trauma of what they had experienced. Back at the police station, they reported what had happened to the chief of police, but their words were met with absolute skepticism. However, something strange happened. The officers' body cameras had recorded everything, from the flashing lights to the spectral figures in the hospital. Despite the visual evidence, no one could explain the phenomenon. The case was dismissed as inconclusive, but none of the 4 policemen ever returned to the scene or spoke about that night again. St. Mary's Hospital remains empty to this day, but those who pass by swear they hear muffled screams coming from inside on the darkest nights. 3. The Man Without a Face. It was an ordinary night in the suburbs of a small town in the state of Maine in the United States. The cold February wind blew through the deserted streets, while the yellow lights on the street lamps flickered intermittently. It was then that residents began to report something unusual. A strange man, tall and thin, prowling the neighborhood. The most disturbing detail? He had no face. The reports reached the local police station, and 2 officers were assigned to investigate the case: veteran detective Richard Hayes and his rookie partner, Emily Carter. To Richard, it seemed more like a case of mass hysteria or teenage pranks. Emily, however, felt an inexplicable chill as she listened to the details of the reports. "No face," she repeated softly as she read the descriptions. "How is that possible?" That same night, the 2 of them patrolled the streets of the neighborhood in search of the mysterious man. The silence was almost absolute, except for the occasional sound of the wind and dry leaves being dragged along the ground. "It's just an urban legend," said Richard, trying to break the tension. But before Emily could reply, something caught her eye. At the end of the poorly lit street, a tall, motionless figure was standing under the light of a street lamp. He was wearing a black suit and had a rigid posture that seemed unnatural. "That's him," whispered Emily, pointing with her flickering flashlight. Richard got out of the car with his gun in his hand. "Police! Identify yourself!" The figure didn't move. As the two slowly approached, they realized what the locals had described. Where there should have been a human face, there was only a smooth, pale surface like melted wax. "What the hell is that?" muttered Richard, as Emily instinctively backed away. Suddenly, the faceless man turned slowly and started walking in the opposite direction. The policeman followed him through the deserted streets, but he always seemed to be one step ahead. When they finally turned a corner to catch up with him, he had disappeared. "That doesn't make sense," said Emily, panting. "He was right here." Richard was silent for a moment before suggesting that they go back to the police station, but something in his expression showed that he was just as shaken as his partner. That night, they both tried to forget the incident and go to sleep. However, sleep brought something much worse: nightmares. Emily dreamt that she was trapped in a dark, endless corridor. In the distance, she saw the silhouette of the faceless man slowly approaching. No matter how much she ran or screamed for help, he was always there, getting closer and closer. Richard had a different but equally disturbing dream. He was in a room full of broken mirrors. In the distorted reflection of each piece of glass, he saw the faceless man standing behind him, motionless and silent. They both woke up in a cold sweat and with the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Over the next few days, the nightmares continued, ever more intense and real. The faceless man didn't just haunt them in their dreams, he seemed to know things about them that no one else knew. It was then that Richard began to notice a disturbing pattern. The nightmares brought back memories of an old case he had tried to forget, a brutal crime that took place years ago. At the time, he and another colleague had covered up evidence to protect an influential politician involved in the murder of a young woman. Emily also began to catch glimpses of this same crime in her dreams, even though she had never heard of it before. She saw flashes of the crime scene, blood splattered across the wooden floor of an isolated cabin in the woods, and the young woman's body with empty eyes fixed on the ceiling. "This can't be a coincidence," Emily said when she confronted Richard at the police station one morning. "These dreams, they're showing us something." Richard tried to deny it at first, but finally gave in to the mounting pressure of the nightmares and the guilt accumulated over the years. He confessed everything: how he had helped hide evidence to protect his corrupt partner, how the case was dismissed as a suicide, and how he had been carrying this weight ever since. "Do you think he's here because of that?" asked Emily in a shaky voice. "I don't know," Richard answered honestly, "but it seems we can't get away from it." Determined to put an end to their torment, the two decided to return to the cottage where the crime had taken place years ago. The property had been abandoned ever since, covered in dense vegetation and shrouded in oppressive silence. When they entered the dark and dusty cabin, they immediately felt a strange presence. The walls seemed to pulsate slightly with every step they took. It was then that the faceless man appeared again, this time inside the hut. He was standing in the center of the main room, as still as before. "Why?" shouted Richard in desperation. "What do you want from us?" The faceless man didn't reply with words. Instead, he slowly raised a pale hand and pointed to the floor where dark stains were still visible, traces of the blood spilled so many years ago. Emily fell to her knees as flashes of the crime flooded her mind. The victim begging for his life, the muffled screams, Richard's bloody hands as he cleaned up the evidence. "He wants justice," Emily whispered with tears streaming down her face. Richard finally understood the full weight of his past actions. He collapsed next to her on the floor of the hut and began mumbling desperate apologies, not only to the victim, but also to himself. The faceless man stepped forward and spread his hands over them as if blessing or condemning them. Then he disappeared as silently as he had appeared. The next morning, Richard was found dead in his house from unexplained causes, his face frozen in an expression of absolute dread. Emily left the police force shortly afterwards and devoted her life to investigating closed or unsolved cases as a way of atoning for her own guilt at having ignored the signs for so long. The legend of the faceless man continued to haunt that small neighborhood in Maine for years after that, a grim reminder that not all secrets can be buried forever. If you're enjoying the stories so far, please subscribe to the channel. This not only helps my work a lot, but also ensures that you don't miss out on any scary content like this. Let's continue with the next stories. 4. The Ghost Car. It was a cold, silent dawn in the small town of Ashwood, in the state of Oregon, when something inexplicable happened. At the central police station, the officers on duty were surprised to find an old car parked in the yard. The vehicle was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if it had been abandoned for years. The identification number on the hood confirmed it. It was car 302, which disappeared more than 10 years ago during a police operation that ended in tragedy. Sergeant Thomas Blake and young officer Laura Evans were called to investigate. They both remembered the story of Vehicle 302. In 2015, it had disappeared along with 2 officers while they were transporting a group of suspects to the police station. None of the occupants, police officers or detainees were ever found. The vehicle simply vanished without a trace. "This doesn't make sense," said Laura, examining the car with a flashlight. "How can something disappear for so long and just reappear here?" Thomas, more experienced and skeptical, tried to remain calm. "It's probably some kind of prank or administrative error. Let's take a look inside." Opening the driver's door, a strong, musty smell escaped from inside the vehicle. On the back seat, there were dark marks that looked like dried blood. The two exchanged uneasy glances before entering the vehicle to inspect it. As soon as they closed the doors, something strange happened. The engine started by itself, and the doors locked with a loud click. "What's happening?" shouted Laura, trying unsuccessfully to open the door. The car's radio began to emit static before a hoarse voice echoed, "You must pay too." Before they could react, the vehicle sped off on its own, leaving the police station yard at high speed. Thomas and Laura tried everything to stop the car. They pulled the handbrake, switched off the ignition, but nothing worked. The steering wheel turned by itself, as if guided by an invisible force. The city quickly disappeared in the rearview mirror as the car took them to a deserted road surrounded by dense forests. "This isn't possible," Thomas muttered as he looked out of the window. The road seemed endless, shrouded in thick fog that obscured any sign of civilization. After what seemed like hours, the car finally stopped in an open field under a dark, starless sky. The area was strangely illuminated by a pale, supernatural light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. When the two got out of the car, they realized that they were not alone. Spectral figures began to emerge from the mist around them. They were the spirits of criminals who had died unjustly while in police custody. Men and women with grotesque injuries that reflected the circumstances of their deaths. "You are no different from them," said one of the figures, pointing at Thomas and Laura with bony, translucent fingers. "You bear the weight of injustices committed in the name of the law." Laura tried to argue. "We didn't do anything. We don't know what happened to you." But the spirits ignored her words and began to slowly surround them. Thomas recognized some of the faces among the apparitions. They were the detainees who had disappeared along with the 302 car years ago. Suddenly, flashes of the past began to flood the minds of the two policemen as if they were memories forcibly implanted. They saw scenes from the night the vehicle disappeared. the two officers responsible for the escort arguing violently with the detainees, muffled screams, shots fired inside the vehicle. The images clearly showed that the detainees had been summarily executed by the police officers during transportation, a cruel act of personal revenge disguised as the fulfillment of duty. After that, something inexplicable happened. The vehicle was swallowed up by the darkness, along with everyone involved. That can't be true, said Thomas, staggering backwards as the visions continued. He realized that the spirits weren't just after the car's former occupants. They were seeking justice against any representative of the law who crossed their path. Laura began to cry as the spectral figures drew ever closer. What do they want? How can we get out of here? One of the apparitions replied in a cold voice, "You must confess your sins, or you will share our fate." Thomas knew there was no easy way out of this situation. He fell to his knees on the cold floor and began to speak. I know that mistakes have been made in the past. We weren't perfect, but I swear I would never condone anything like that. Laura did the same, begging for forgiveness. We just want to help people. Please, let us go. For a moment, silence overtook the dark field as the spirits seemed to ponder their words. Then one of them spoke. You'll have your chance, but remember, we're always watching. The supernatural light began to disappear along with the spectral figures, leaving only darkness around the two policemen. Suddenly, they were back at the police station, sitting inside the 302 parked exactly where they had entered hours before. The doors were unlocked and the engine was off. Thomas and Laura got out of the car in absolute silence, unable to explain what had happened that dark night. They knew only one thing: they would never be the same again. Car 302 was immediately sealed as evidence and sent to a remote warehouse where no one would ever dare touch it again. But even so, rumors began to circulate among local police officers. Those who passed by the depot swore they heard voices whispering inside the vehicle, voices calling for justice for those whose lives had been taken for no reason. And so another dark legend about the ghost car was born, a terrifying reminder of the consequences of injustices committed under the guise of the law. 5. The Call of House 42. It was a rainy, cold night when the Central Police Station in a small town in Colorado received an emergency call. A woman reported screams and sounds of a struggle coming from an isolated house on the outskirts, known as House 42. The address was familiar to the officers, but not for the best of reasons. For decades, the house had been the scene of disturbing stories, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and rumors of supernatural activity. Sergeant Jack Miller and rookie officer Rachel Carter were assigned to the scene. Jack, a veteran of the police force, was known for his skepticism and practical approach. Rachel, on the other hand, was in her first year on the force and was still amazed by the stories she heard from her colleagues. "House 42?" she asked as she adjusted her gun belt. "Isn't that the one they say is haunted?" Jack snorted. "Stories to scare children. Let's do our job and get out of there quickly." When they arrived at the site, the rain was pouring down in torrents, and the wind made the trees around the house sway as if they were alive. House 42 was an old building, with broken windows and walls covered in moss. The lights were off, but there was something unsettling in the air, an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up even the sound of the rain. Jack knocked on the door, while Rachel illuminated the entrance with her flashlight. "Police! Open the door!" There was no reply. After a few minutes, they decided to go in. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The smell of mold mixed with something metallic invaded their nostrils. "Is anyone here?" Rachel called out, but her voice echoed as if the house had been empty for a long time. However, when they entered the living room, they found something disconcerting. A family sitting on the sofa. A man, a woman, and two small children were motionless, looking directly at the police officers with neutral expressions. "Sir, we received a call about domestic violence," said Jack, trying to remain calm. "Is everything all right here?" The man smiled slightly and replied, "Of course, officer. We're perfectly fine." But something was wrong. The children's eyes seemed glazed over, almost like porcelain dolls. The woman didn't blink as she stared at Rachel. "Can we have a look around the house?" asked Jack. "Make yourselves at home," said the man in an overly calm tone. While Jack went upstairs to check the rooms, Rachel stayed in the living room trying to talk to the family. But the answers were vague and disconnected. When she asked the children their names, they simply laughed in unison, a high-pitched, disturbing sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Upstairs, Jack found empty, dust-covered rooms. But in one of them there was something strange. An old mirror hanging on the wall reflected the corridor behind him, except that the reflection showed shadowy figures moving where there was no one. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly with his gun in his hand, but there was no one there. "Rachel?" he called over the radio. "Yes?" she answered from the living room. "Stay alert. There's something wrong here." When Jack went downstairs to join Rachel, he found the room completely empty. The family had disappeared without a trace. "Rachel!" he called out again. "I'm here," she replied. But her voice came from the opposite direction to the room he had been in moments before. When he followed her into the kitchen, he found Rachel standing in front of an open door that led to the basement. "I heard something down there," she said nervously. Reluctantly, the two of them went down the narrow flight of stairs together into the dark, damp basement. Downstairs they found strange symbols drawn on the walls with something that looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was a circle made of unlit candles. It was then that they heard children's laughter echoing around them, but there was no one there apart from themselves. When they went back upstairs to leave the house, they realized something terrifying. They were back in the room where they had first met the family. And there they were again, sitting on the sofa, as if nothing had happened. This isn't possible," stammered Rachel, as she slowly backed away. Jack tried to open the front door to get out, but it was locked, even without a visible lock. As they repeatedly tried to escape the house, they realized that each attempt brought them back to the same point, the living room with the family lying motionless on the sofa. With each cycle, the figures' expressions became more distorted, the smiles wider and more grotesque, the eyes deeper and emptier. Rachel began to remember fragments of the initial call, desperate cries for help, but now it seemed that the voices were coming directly from the house itself. Jack finally confronted the man on the sofa. "What do you want? Why are we stuck here?" The man tilted his head slowly before replying, "You came in uninvited. Now you belong to the house." It was then that Rachel noticed something disturbing about one of the old photographs hanging on the wall. It showed two policemen sitting at a table, but their faces were blurred, as if they had been erased by time. Desperate to escape the endless nightmare, Jack and Rachel decided to destroy the circle in the basement, believing that it could be the source of the house's power. As they broke the circle with their weapons, they heard deafening screams echoing off the walls. For a brief moment, everything was completely silent before they were violently thrown out of the house through the front door. When they opened their eyes again, they were standing in the cold rain outside, alive but deeply shaken. House 42 seemed unchanged from the outside, but now they bore invisible scars from that macabre encounter. 6. The child on the road. It was a cold, silent dawn in the Montana countryside. The night patrol of officers James Carter and Olivia Reed was quiet until the moment they spotted something unusual on the deserted road. In the dim light of the headlights, a small child, no more than 6 years old, was standing in the middle of the asphalt, wearing white pajamas that seemed to glow in the moonlight. James braked sharply, and both policemen got out of the car. "Hey, are you all right?" asked Olivia, trying to sound calm as she approached slowly. The child didn't answer. She just stood there, motionless, her head tilted slightly to one side. "This isn't normal," muttered James, keeping his hand close to the holster of his gun. "Where are her parents?" Olivia bent down to the child's height. "Are you lost? We can help you find your home." But the girl remained silent, her eyes fixed on a distant point in the darkness of the road. Suddenly, she raised her arm and pointed to something ahead, an old, neglected cemetery that lay beside the road. The gravestones were covered in moss, and a thick fog seemed to envelop the place like a veil. "This is getting weird," said James, eyeing the cemetery suspiciously. "Maybe she came from there. Let's check it out." The two policemen led the child to the rusty gate of the cemetery. The place looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Olivia held the flashlight tightly as she illuminated the path between the worn tombstones. The girl was walking ahead of them now, as if she knew exactly where she was going. "This doesn't seem right," said James, looking around. "Why would a child be alone here in the middle of the night?" Before Olivia could answer, the girl stopped abruptly in front of a large, cracked gravestone. She turned slowly towards the policeman and smiled. But something was wrong. Her eyes were completely black, without irises or pupils. "James, that's not a child," whispered Olivia as she instinctively backed away. Suddenly, the girl began to emit a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the mist around them began to move as if it had a life of its own. The policemen's flashlights began to flicker uncontrollably before going out completely. In the dark, they heard childish laughter echoing through the cemetery, but there was no one there apart from them. "Get out of here!" shouted James as he drew his gun. But when he tried to shoot the child figure, it disappeared before his eyes. It was then that things got worse. The gravestones began to shake and crack as shadowy figures emerged from the ground. They were deformed, angry spirits, their faces distorted into expressions of pain and rage. "Run!" shouted Olivia, pulling James by the arm as they tried to get back to the cemetery gate. But every time they ran towards the exit, they found themselves back in the same place, in front of the same cracked gravestone where it all began. "We're trapped!" said James with despair in his voice. The girl reappeared in front of them, now floating above the ground with a sinister expression on her blank face. "You shouldn't have come," she said in a voice that seemed to be made up of several different voices. The spirits slowly began to surround them, their spectral hands outstretched as if to drag them to the ground. James looked at Olivia with determination in his eyes. "I'll distract them. You need to get out of here." "No, I'm not leaving you," protested Olivia. "We have no choice," he shouted, before running in the opposite direction to attract the spirits. Olivia hesitated for a moment before taking the opportunity to run towards the gate again. This time she made it through, but when she looked back, she saw James being swallowed up by the mist, along with the spirits. The car was still parked by the side of the road when Olivia arrived, panting and covered in a cold sweat. She got into the car and sped off without looking back. The next morning, Olivia returned to the cemetery with a search party, but there was no sign of James or the child. The place looked completely different in daylight. The gravestones were intact and overgrown with weeds. There was no evidence of the supernatural events of the night before. Despite her colleagues' doubts and skeptical looks, Olivia knew what she had seen, and she knew she would never forget that terrifying night on the deserted road. Ever since, drivers passing through the area have reported seeing a little girl alone on the side of the road at night. But no one dares stop to help her. 7. The Cursed Radio. It was a cold, silent dawn in the town of Coldwater in the state of Michigan. Car 108 was on patrol when something unusual happened. The radio, which until then had been emitting only the usual static, began to broadcast a weak, trembling voice. "Please, help me. I'm stuck." The message was interrupted by squeaks, but the location was clear: an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Officers David Harper and Megan Lewis looked at each other, puzzled. "That's not right," said David, adjusting the volume on the radio. "This place has been abandoned for years." Megan, however, insisted that they check it out. "If someone is asking for help, we need to investigate." When they arrived at the warehouse, the place looked as desolate as it ever had. The windows were broken, and the building was covered in graffiti and undergrowth. However, something seemed strange. There were fresh tire marks on the dirt driveway. With flashlights in hand, the two entered the building. The air was heavy and smelled musty. As they explored the dark corridors, they heard rapid footsteps echoing in the distance. "Who's there?" shouted Megan, but the only response was the sound of something falling in one of the rooms. When they reached the source of the noise, they found an old radio on a dusty table. It was on, and emitting the same voice they had heard in the car. "Please, help me." But there was no one there. Suddenly the flashlights began to flicker, and a low laugh echoed through the building. David pulled Megan by the arm. "Let's get out of here now!" As they returned to the car, they noticed that the tire tracks had disappeared, as if they had never existed. Back on the road, the car's radio beeped again. This time, it was a deep, male voice. "You need to get to Hillcrest Cemetery, quickly." Megan looked at David with wide eyes. "This has got to be some kind of prank." David hesitated before answering. "What if it isn't? We're already involved in this." Arriving at the cemetery, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than in the warehouse. The mist crept between the headstones like ghostly fingers. The radio kept squawking, with indistinct voices that seemed to whisper their names. As they walked among the old gravestones, something caught their eye: an open grave with a partially exposed coffin. Inside was a broken mirror and a yellowed piece of paper with the words scribbled on it: "You cannot escape judgment." Suddenly, spectral figures began to appear around them, deformed faces and empty eyes that seemed to silently accuse them. "David, what's going on?" asked Megan in a trembling voice. "I don't know," he replied as they slowly retreated to the car. As they got into the car and sped away from the cemetery, the radio began to broadcast something different. Recordings of familiar voices. It was David arguing with another policeman years ago about an undercover case, an incident in which a suspect had died in custody under suspicious circumstances. "That's impossible," muttered David as he switched off the radio in a panic. Megan looked at him with growing suspicion. "David, what have you done?" Before he could answer, another recording began. This time it was Megan's voice screaming during an unsuccessful operation that resulted in the death of an innocent civilian. They were both completely silent as the recordings continued to expose their past mistakes. The radio then broadcast one last message: "You need to go back to where it all began." With no choice, the two followed the instructions to an old abandoned police station on the outskirts of town, the place where they had both started their careers years ago. As they entered the dark, decaying building, they were confronted by visions of the people whose deaths were linked to their mistakes. The spectral figures slowly surrounded them while whispering, "You must pay." David tried to beg forgiveness in desperation. "We were young. We didn't know what we were doing." But Megan noticed something strange. While David begged for mercy, the spirits seemed to focus only on him. "You knew more than you told me," she said with anger and fear growing in her voice. David finally confessed he had manipulated evidence to cover up his own guilt in the past incidents, including blaming Megan for decisions that had been his. The spirits advanced on David, while Megan managed to escape by running out of the police station. The next morning, Megan was found by fellow police officers wandering along the main road in a state of shock. She told her story, but no one believed her completely, except for the fact that car 108 was never seen again. Since that night, reports of strange voices on the police radio have begun to emerge among local officers. Some say they hear calls for help. Others claim to hear whispered confessions in the midst of the static, and they all agree on one thing: never ignore calls from beyond, because they may be coming to collect old debts. And those were the 7 horror stories involving policemen. So, what did you think? Which of these stories gave you the creeps? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what you think. If you liked the video, don't forget to like it. It really helps the channel grow and brings you even more scary content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.